The wind howled across the empty plains of Colorado, carrying with it a biting chill that seeped through even the thickest layers of clothing. In the dim light of a crescent moon, an old, rusted pickup truck pulled off to the side of a desolate road. The headlights illuminated the barren landscape, casting long shadows on the frosty ground. Inside the truck, a young boy, no older than 6, sat silently, clutching a worn, patched-up teddy bear. His small hands trembled as he hugged the toy closer, sensing the tension in the air. "Do we really have to do this, Tom?" Diane's voice broke the silence, trembling with suppressed emotion. She gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles turning white. In the rearview mirror, her gaze locked on her son. Ethan's wide, brown eyes stared back, filled with confusion and fear. "We don't have a choice, Diane," Tom replied sharply, though his own voice betrayed a hint of doubt. He avoided her gaze, instead fumbling with the zipper of his worn jacket. "You know we can't keep him. We've tried. But this is the only way." Diane's breathing quickened. "He's our son," she whispered, her voice cracking. "How can you just leave him here?" Tom's jaw clenched. "And what's the alternative? Watch him starve with us? Freeze in that damn trailer?" He exhaled deeply, his breath visible in the cold night air. "Someone will find him. Someone who can give him a life we can't." Ethan, sitting quietly in the back seat, clung tighter to his bear. "Mommy?" he asked softly, his voice barely audible over the wind outside. "Where are we going?" Diane's heart shattered. She turned around, forcing a smile that didn't reach her tear-filled eyes. "It's just a little trip, sweetheart," she said, reaching out to stroke his cheek. You'll be okay." Tom cleared his throat, his movements stiff as he stepped out of the truck and opened the back door. "Come on, Ethan," he said gruffly, avoiding the boy's questioning gaze. He reached for Ethan's hand, but the child hesitated, shrinking back. "Do I have to go, Daddy?" Ethan's voice quivered, a plea laced with innocent trust. Tom didn't answer. Instead, he gently pulled Ethan out of the truck, setting him down on the side of the road. Diane sat frozen in the driver's seat, her face buried in her hands as sobs racked her body. Tom crouched to Ethan's level, placing a firm hand on his small shoulder. "Listen to me, kiddo," he said, his tone softening. "You're a strong little guy, okay? Someone's going to come and help you real soon." He hesitated, then added, "You just have to wait right here." Ethan blinked up at his father, tears pooling in his eyes. "But I don't want to stay here," he murmured. "I want to go home." Tom couldn't look at him. He stood abruptly and walked back to the truck, his footsteps crunching on the icy ground. Diane raised her head, her tear-streaked face etched with agony. "Tom, don't do this," she begged, her voice breaking. But Tom shook his head. "We have to go." The truck's engine roared to life, drowning out Ethan's cries as he ran after it, his small feet slipping on the frozen dirt. "Mommy, Daddy," he screamed, his voice echoing into the vast emptiness. The truck's taillights faded into the distance, leaving Ethan alone under the cold, indifferent sky. The road stretched endlessly in both directions, flanked by snow-covered fields and sparse trees. Ethan shivered, pulling his thin coat tighter around himself. His teddy bear was his only comfort, its familiar texture grounding him as tears streamed down his face. He didn't understand why his parents had left or when they would come back. All he knew was the crushing silence that surrounded him and the freezing wind that nipped at his small frame. He sat down on the hard ground, curling into himself for warmth. The moon hung high above, casting a pale glow over the desolate landscape. Ethan whispered to his bear, his voice trembling. "It's okay, Mr. Snuggles. They'll come back for us. They have to." But deep down, even at 6 years old, Ethan sensed the truth. They weren't coming back. The icy wind bit at Ethan's cheeks as he sat shivering by the roadside. His small arms clutched the bear tighter against his chest, his teeth chattering as the cold seeped through his thin jacket. The barren plains around him were silent except for the occasional rustle of wind through dry grass. The weight of his loneliness pressed heavily on him, and he fought back tears, whispering to himself, "They'll come back. They have to." Hours passed, and the temperature continued to drop. The distant howl of a coyote echoed across the plains, making Ethan stiffen. He glanced around, his young imagination running wild with images of monsters lurking in the darkness. But what came next was not his imagination. A low growl rumbled from the shadows, and Ethan froze. Emerging from the darkness was a pair of glowing amber eyes, followed by another, then another. His breath hitched as he realized he was surrounded by wolves. Their sleek bodies moved gracefully, their fur blending seamlessly into the night. At the forefront stood a large, gray wolf with piercing yellow eyes that locked onto Ethan. The boy's heart pounded in his chest, his body frozen with fear. He gripped his teddy bear tighter, whispering, "Please don't hurt me." The gray wolf, her ears perked forward, stepped closer, her nose twitching as she sniffed the air around him. The other wolves watched silently, their sharp eyes fixed on the boy. Ethan shut his eyes, expecting the worst, but the attack never came. Instead, the gray wolf sat down a few feet away from him, tilting her head curiously. The boy opened his eyes cautiously, his fear slowly giving way to confusion. "You're not gonna eat me," he murmured, his voice trembling. The gray wolf huffed softly, almost as if amused. Her body language was calm, almost protective. Ethan didn't know what to make of it, but something about her presence was oddly reassuring. He slowly extended a hand, his fingers trembling. Are you nice?" The wolf sniffed his hand, but made no aggressive moves. Instead, she turned to the others in the pack, letting out a low, commanding growl. The other wolves seemed to hesitate before backing away, leaving only her and Ethan in the clearing. Ethan looked into her eyes, his small voice breaking the silence. "Do you have a name?" He paused, then answered himself, "I think I'll call you Shadow. You're kind of scary, but not bad scary." Shadow didn't respond, of course, but her tail flicked slightly as if acknowledging his words. She stepped closer, curling her body around him. To Ethan's surprise, the warmth of her fur against his frozen skin was soothing. He nestled into her side, his shivers subsiding slightly. "Thank you," he whispered, resting his cheek against her thick coat. The boy didn't know how long he sat there, but he felt safer with Shadow than he had since his parents had driven away. As the night wore on, the wolves kept their distance but didn't leave. They formed a loose circle around Ethan and Shadow, their presence a silent warning to any other creatures that might wander too close. Ethan's eyelids grew heavy, and despite the cold, exhaustion overtook him. Shadow stayed by his side, her steady breathing lulling him to sleep. For the first time since he had been abandoned, Ethan felt a sliver of hope. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for now, he wasn't alone. The first rays of sunlight pierced through the dense forest, illuminating the frosty ground and the towering pine trees. Ethan stirred awake, his small body still curled against Shadow's warm side. He blinked groggily, momentarily disoriented, until the events of the previous night came rushing back to him. The gray wolf lay beside him, her amber eyes open and watchful. She seemed to sense his movement and nudged him gently with her nose, as if urging him to get up. Ethan sat up slowly, clutching his teddy bear. His stomach growled loudly, breaking the stillness of the morning. He hadn't eaten since the day before, and the hunger gnawed at him. "I'm so hungry, Shadow," he said, his voice small and hoarse. Shadow stood and stretched, her powerful legs moving with effortless grace. She turned to Ethan, letting out a low whine before padding a few steps ahead. Then she looked back at him, as if signaling him to follow. "Where are we going?" Ethan asked, standing on unsteady legs. He hesitated for a moment, but Shadow's unwavering gaze gave him a strange sense of trust. "Okay," he murmured, gripping his bear tightly as he followed the wolf into the forest. The wilderness was both beautiful and terrifying. Towering trees loomed over him, their branches swaying gently in the wind. The ground was uneven and covered in fallen leaves, patches of snow, and hidden roots that Ethan tripped over more than once. Shadow moved silently ahead of him, occasionally glancing back to ensure he was still following. Hours seemed to pass as they navigated deeper into the forest. Ethan's legs ached, and his hunger became almost unbearable. Just as he was about to collapse from exhaustion, Shadow stopped abruptly. She sniffed the air, her ears twitching, and then darted into a thicket. Ethan waited nervously, clutching his bear. Moments later, Shadow emerged with a small, lifeless rabbit in her jaws. Ethan's stomach churned at the sight, but Shadow dropped the rabbit at his feet, nudging it toward him with her nose. Ethan stared at it, unsure of what to do. I can't eat that," he said, tears welling up in his eyes. "It's not cooked, and it's—" He trailed off, his voice breaking. Shadow huffed and lay down beside him, tearing into the rabbit herself. Ethan turned away, his stomach twisting with a mix of hunger and nausea. After a while, Shadow stopped eating and nudged a small, untouched portion of meat toward him. Her gaze was steady, almost urging. Ethan hesitated, but finally reached for the piece. His hands trembled as he took a small bite, grimacing at the taste. It was far from the warm meals he was used to, but it filled the aching void in his stomach. He ate slowly, tears streaming down his face as he whispered, "Thank you, Shadow." As the days passed, Ethan began to adapt to life with the wolves. Shadow and her pack moved with purpose, teaching him through their actions. He learned to find water in small streams and to seek shelter beneath dense bushes or in hollowed-out logs. He mimicked their movements, walking softly and staying low to the ground to avoid being seen by predators. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan sat by a small fire he had managed to build with Shadow's help. She had brought him a stick, and by watching her scratch the ground with her claws, Ethan had figured out how to use rocks to create sparks. The fire was small and flickering, but it gave him warmth and light in the encroaching darkness. "I don't know if my mom and dad are coming back," Ethan admitted aloud, his voice breaking. He glanced at Shadow, who sat beside him, her ears twitching attentively. "But I think maybe it's better if they don't." He swallowed hard, wiping his eyes. "They left me. You didn't." Shadow nudged him gently with her head, a gesture that felt like comfort. Ethan smiled faintly, resting his hand on her thick fur. In that moment, he realized he wasn't just surviving. He was learning, growing stronger, and finding a new kind of family in the wilderness. The sharp snap of a twig echoed through the stillness of the forest, startling Ethan as he crouched near a small stream, cupping his hands to drink. Shadow, ever alert, raised her head, her ears twitching toward the sound. The rest of the pack, lounging nearby, immediately stood and bristled, their instincts warning of an intruder. Ethan froze, his heart pounding as he scanned the dense woods. The sound of steady, deliberate footsteps grew louder. "Shadow," he whispered, clutching her fur. "What is it?" Before he could say another word, a voice rang out, firm but kind. "Hello? Anyone out there?" Ethan's breath hitched. It wasn't the cold or fear this time. It was the sound of another human. The wolves snarled, forming a protective circle around him. Shadow stood at the front, her tail raised high, her growl low and menacing. Emerging from the trees was a man, rugged and weathered, dressed in a thick flannel shirt and sturdy boots. His hat was tipped low, but his kind eyes scanned the area, landing on Ethan and the pack of wolves surrounding him. His hands instinctively raised, palms out, in a gesture of peace. "Easy now," he said softly, addressing the wolves. His voice was calm but firm, as if he had dealt with wild animals before. His gaze shifted to Ethan, and his eyes widened with shock. "Kid, what are you doing out here?" Ethan didn't respond, unsure whether to trust the stranger. The man crouched slowly, keeping his movements deliberate. "I'm Jack," he said. "I live a few miles from here. Are you alone?" "No," Ethan replied softly, glancing at Shadow. "I have them." Jack's eyebrows furrowed as he looked at the boy more closely. His dirt-streaked face, the oversized jacket, the stuffed bear clutched tightly in one hand. "How long have you been out here?" Jack asked, his tone now filled with concern. Ethan hesitated. "A few days, I think." The man let out a low whistle. "Well, kid, you're lucky you're alive. These woods aren't kind to anyone, let alone a little guy like you," Shadow growled, stepping forward as if to warn Jack to keep his distance. Jack met her gaze, his expression softening. "I'm not here to hurt him," he said, almost as if Shadow could understand. "I want to help." Ethan looked between Jack and Shadow, torn. He had grown to trust the wolves, but the sight of another human stirred something inside him, a longing for warmth, safety, and the comfort of a home. "Shadow," he whispered, kneeling beside her. "It's okay. I think he's nice." The wolf looked at Ethan, her golden eyes searching his face, before she reluctantly stepped back. The pack followed suit, though they stayed close, watching Jack's every move. Jack took off his jacket and approached slowly, draping it over Ethan's shoulders. "You're freezing, kid," he said gently. "Let's get you somewhere warm." "I don't want to leave them," Ethan murmured, his voice trembling. "They're my family now." Jack crouched beside him, his expression both kind and serious. "I get it," he said. "They've been looking out for you, and that's something special. But you need food, real food, and a roof over your head. You can't survive out here forever." Ethan glanced back at Shadow, tears welling up in his eyes. "Will they come with me?" Jack shook his head. "They're wild animals, son. This is their home." He paused. "But you can always come back and visit them." Ethan nodded slowly, his heart breaking at the thought of leaving Shadow and the pack. He stood, his legs shaky, and looked at Shadow. "I'll come back," he promised, his voice barely above a whisper. "I won't forget you." Shadow nudged his hand one last time, her soft whine echoing in the quiet forest. Ethan clung to her for a moment before finally stepping toward Jack, who offered his hand. Together, they walked out of the woods, the wolves watching silently until they disappeared from sight. The warmth of the farmhouse was overwhelming after days in the biting cold. Ethan stepped into the cozy living room, his eyes widening as he took in the space. A large fireplace crackled with flames, casting a golden glow across the wooden floors. The scent of fresh bread and roasted vegetables wafted through the air, making his stomach ache with hunger. Jack hung his jacket on a peg near the door and knelt to Ethan's level. "You're safe now, kid," he said gently. "Welcome to my home." Ethan nodded, clutching his bear tightly. He hadn't spoken much since leaving the forest, his mind still lingering on Shadow and the pack. Jack seemed to sense his unease and didn't push him, instead guiding him toward a soft, overstuffed couch near the fire. "You sit here and warm up," Jack said, disappearing into the kitchen. A few minutes later, he returned with a steaming bowl of soup and a thick slice of bread. "Here, eat." Ethan hesitated, then reached for the bowl, the warmth of it soothing against his chilled hands. He took a tentative sip, and the rich, savory flavors made his eyes water. He ate quickly, the gnawing hunger finally subsiding. Jack watched him with a mixture of relief and curiosity. "So," he began carefully, "what's your name, kid?" "Ethan," the boy murmured, his voice barely audible. Jack nodded. "Well, Ethan, I'm Jack. I've got this place all to myself, so you can stay as long as you need. But I've got to ask, how did you end up out there all alone?" Ethan froze, his spoon hovering over the bowl. The question brought back the painful memories he had been trying to push away. "My mom and dad, they left me," he whispered, his voice cracking. Jack's brow furrowed, his jaw tightening. "They left you," he repeated, disbelief and anger flickering across his face. "Why would they do that?" Ethan shook his head, tears streaming down his cheeks. "They said, They couldn't take care of me. Jack took a deep breath, his fists clenching briefly before he forced himself to relax. I'm sorry, kid. No one deserves that, especially not someone your age. He reached out, placing a reassuring hand on Ethan's shoulder. You're safe here, okay? I'll make sure of that. Over the next few weeks, Ethan began to settle into life on the farm. Jack taught him how to feed the chickens, gather eggs, and care for the horses in the barn. At first, Ethan was timid, sticking close to Jack and keeping to himself. But gradually, the boy began to open up, finding comfort in the daily routines and the gentle rhythm of farm life. One crisp morning, as Ethan helped Jack fix a broken fence, he hesitated and looked toward the distant line of trees marking the forest's edge. Do you think Shadow's okay? He asked, his voice quiet. Jack paused, glancing at the boy. Shadow? He asked. My wolf, Ethan explained, his expression serious. She protected me. I think she's my friend. Jack leaned against the fence, wiping his hands on a rag. I think Shadow's doing just fine. Wolves are strong. She probably misses you too, in her own way. Ethan smiled faintly, feeling a pang of longing but comforted by Jack's words. I want to see her again someday. Jack nodded. You will. But for now, let's make sure you're strong enough to face her world again when the time comes. Despite the warmth and safety of the farm, Ethan couldn't shake the deep connection he felt with Shadow and the wilderness. At night, he would sit by his window, staring out at the moonlit fields and imagining the wolves running through the forest. He whispered quiet promises to Shadow, vowing to return to her and the pack. Jack noticed the boy's restlessness but didn't press him. Instead, he focused on building trust and helping Ethan heal. One evening, as they sat together by the fire, Jack said, You know, Ethan, you're stronger than most grown-ups I've met. Surviving out there like you did? That's something incredible. Ethan looked up, his eyes wide. Do you think so? Jack nodded firmly. I know so. And you've got a whole life ahead of you to do even more incredible things. For the first time in weeks, Ethan smiled, a genuine, hopeful smile. For now, he was learning what it meant to feel safe, loved, and at home. But deep in his heart, he knew his journey wasn't over. Shadow and the pack were still out there, and one day, he would find his way back to them. Months passed on the farm, and Ethan began to blossom under Jack's care. The boy, once shy and withdrawn, now smiled more often and spoke freely about his thoughts and dreams. He grew stronger, helping Jack with the daily chores and exploring the sprawling fields that surrounded the farmhouse. But even as he built a new life, the memory of his parents lingered like a shadow in his mind, an unanswered question he wasn't sure he wanted resolved. It was a warm afternoon when the sound of tires crunching on gravel broke the usual quiet of the farm. Ethan looked up from where he was brushing one of the horses, his small hands halting mid-stroke. A dusty sedan pulled into the driveway, and Jack stepped out of the barn, his brow furrowing as he wiped his hands on a rag. A man and woman emerged from the car. The woman was visibly anxious, her hands wringing together as she scanned the yard. The man, taller and more composed, rested a hand on her shoulder. When their eyes landed on Ethan, the woman let out a small gasp. Ethan, she called, taking a hesitant step forward. Ethan froze, his heart pounding in his chest. His hands gripped the brush tightly as he stared at the faces he hadn't seen in months, his parents. Jack approached cautiously, his protective instincts kicking in. Can I help you? Jack asked, his tone measured but firm. The man cleared his throat. We're Ethan's parents. We've been looking for him. Jack's eyes narrowed slightly. Is that so? He glanced back at Ethan, who remained frozen in place. Because from what I understand, you left him out there on his own. The woman burst into tears, her voice cracking as she spoke. We didn't want to, but we had no choice. We were desperate. We thought someone would find him. Someone who could take better care of him than we could. Jack's jaw tightened, but he stepped aside, giving Ethan space to make his own decision. The boy's mind raced as he tried to process the scene. His mother's tear-streaked face, his father's averted gaze, the memories of that cold night when they had left him behind. All of it came rushing back. Finally, Ethan spoke, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Why did you leave me?" he asked, his small frame trembling. His mother stepped closer, her hands reaching out but stopping short when she saw him flinch. "Ethan, we were scared," she said. "We didn't have enough food, or money, or anything. We thought it was the only way to give you a chance." His father nodded, his voice low. "We were wrong, son. Leaving you was the worst mistake we've ever made." Ethan's eyes filled with tears. "You didn't even come back?" he whispered. "I waited, and you didn't come back." The raw pain in his voice cut through the air like a knife. His mother broke down, sobbing into her hands, while his father struggled to find the words to respond. Jack stepped forward, his hand resting gently on Ethan's shoulder. "You don't have to decide anything right now," Jack said softly. "This is your choice, Ethan." The boy looked at Jack, then back at his parents. He thought of the months he had spent with Shadow and the wolves, how they had protected him and taught him to survive. He thought of Jack, who had opened his home and his heart to a scared, lonely boy. And he thought of his parents, who had made a terrible choice but now stood before him, begging for a second chance. "I'm not ready to come back with you," Ethan said finally, his voice steady but resolute. "I have a family here now, with Jack and with Shadow. But maybe I can see you sometimes." His mother nodded through her tears, her face a mixture of relief and sadness. "Of course," she said. "We'll do whatever it takes, Ethan. We just want to make it right." Ethan turned back to Jack, who gave him a small, encouraging smile. "You're a brave kid," Jack said quietly. "Whatever you decide, I'll stand by you." As his parents drove away, Ethan felt a weight lift from his chest. The pain of their abandonment would never fully disappear, but he had taken the first step toward healing. For now, he would continue building his life on the farm, strengthened by the love and trust he had found there, and by the bond he still shared with Shadow and the wilderness that had shaped him. Ethan's days on the farm stretched into a comforting routine. He fed the chickens at sunrise, helped Jack mend fences, and played fetch with Daisy, Jack's old border collie. But every so often, his gaze would wander to the dense forest on the horizon. The bond he had forged with Shadow and the wolves lingered in his heart, a constant pull back to the wilderness where he had first found safety. One crisp autumn morning, Ethan stood at the edge of the forest, his boots crunching on fallen leaves. Jack approached him from behind, a thermos of hot cocoa in one hand. "Thinking about going back, aren't you?" Jack asked, his tone gentle. Ethan nodded, not looking away from the trees. "I miss them. Shadow, the pack. It's like they're my family too." Jack handed him the thermos and crouched beside him. "You know, Ethan, family doesn't have to be just one thing or one place. It's okay to love both worlds." Ethan sipped the cocoa, the warmth spreading through him. "Do you think they remember me?" he asked, his voice small. Jack smiled faintly. "If they're anything like you, they don't forget the ones they care about." That afternoon, Ethan decided to visit the forest. Jack helped him pack a small bag with some snacks, water, and a flashlight, just in case. "Be careful, and don't go too far," Jack reminded him as he watched the boy disappear into the trees. Ethan navigated the familiar paths, his senses sharper than they had been months ago. The forest felt alive with sounds, the rustle of leaves, the chirping of birds, and the distant babble of a stream. He followed the trail Shadow had often taken, his heart pounding with anticipation. As he rounded a bend, a soft growl stopped him in his tracks. He froze, clutching his bear tightly. Slowly, he turned to see a pair of golden eyes watching him from the shadows. A mix of fear and excitement coursed through him. "Shadow," he called softly. The gray wolf stepped into the clearing, her tail held high, her posture alert. When her eyes met Ethan's, her body relaxed. She let out a low, almost welcoming whine and trotted toward him. Ethan dropped to his knees, tears streaming down his face. "I missed you," he whispered, reaching out to touch her fur. Shadow nuzzled his hand, her warmth and presence instantly soothing. The rest of the pack began to emerge from the trees, their movements cautious but curious. Ethan laughed through his tears, his voice filled with joy. "I'm back," he said. "I told you I'd come back." Ethan spent hours with the wolves, sharing the snacks he had packed and watching as they moved gracefully through their territory. Shadow stayed by his side, her watchful eyes never leaving him. As the sun began to set, Ethan knew it was time to return to the farm. "I'll visit again soon," he promised, stroking Shadow's head. "I won't stay away for so long next time." Shadow seemed to understand. She gave him a final nudge before retreating into the forest with the pack. Ethan stood for a moment, watching them disappear into the shadows, before turning back toward the farm. That evening, Ethan sat with Jack on the porch, watching the stars. "You're smiling a lot tonight," Jack said, handing Ethan a mug of warm milk. "I saw them," Ethan replied, his eyes bright. "Shadow and the pack. They're okay." Jack nodded, a proud smile on his face. "Good. They're a part of you, Ethan. Just like this place is now." Ethan leaned back in his chair, his heart full. For the first time, he didn't feel torn between the two worlds. He was learning how to belong to both, carrying the lessons and love from each wherever he went. As the seasons changed, so did Ethan. Now nearly a year older and wiser, he had grown into a boy who straddled two worlds, the safety of Jack's farm and the untamed wilderness where Shadow and her pack roamed. But the more time he spent exploring the mountains and forests, the more he noticed troubling changes. Trees were being marked with red spray paint, and strange machines had begun to appear at the forest's edge, their engines growling like metal beasts. One afternoon, Ethan returned from a walk with Shadow to find Jack sitting at the kitchen table, a folded newspaper in his hands and a worried expression on his face. "What's wrong?" Ethan asked, setting his bag down. Jack sighed and slid the newspaper across the table. "It's this," he said, pointing to a headline. "Development project threatens forest land." Ethan's stomach twisted as he read the article. It detailed plans for a large-scale logging operation that would cut down significant portions of the forest where Shadow and her pack lived. "They can't do this," Ethan said, his voice trembling. "That's their home." "I know, kid," Jack said, "but these things aren't easy to stop. It's all about money, and those companies have a lot of it." Ethan clenched his fists, determination rising in his chest. "We have to do something. We can't let them destroy the forest." Over the next few days, Ethan and Jack began to brainstorm ways to fight back. Jack suggested reaching out to local conservation groups, while Ethan thought about how he could use his story to make people care about the wolves and the forest. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Ethan had an idea. "What if I tell them what happened to me?" he said, looking at Jack. "About how Shadow and the pack saved me. Maybe if people hear that, they'll want to protect the forest." Jack rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "That's a powerful story, Ethan," he said, "but it takes a lot of courage to share something so personal. Are you sure you're ready?" Ethan nodded firmly. "If it means saving Shadow in the forest, I'll do it." The following week, Jack and Ethan attended a town hall meeting about the logging project. The small community center was packed with people, residents, business owners, and a few representatives from the logging company. Ethan sat nervously in the front row, his hands gripping the edges of his chair. Jack leaned over and whispered, "You've got this, kid." When it was time for public comments, Jack nudged Ethan gently. The boy stood, his heart pounding as he walked to the microphone. The room fell silent as the crowd took in his small frame and serious expression. "My name is Ethan," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "and I want to tell you a story." He spoke about the night his parents had left him, how he had survived in the forest with the help of a wolf named Shadow and her pack. He described how they had protected him, taught him to survive, and became his family when he had no one else. His voice grew stronger as he talked about the bond he shared with the wolves and the beauty of the forest they called home. These trees, the streams, the animals. They're not just things, Ethan said, his eyes scanning the room. They're alive, just like us. And if we destroy them, we're destroying part of ourselves. When he finished, the room was silent for a moment. Then, one by one, people began to clap. Some stood, others wiped their eyes, moved by the raw honesty of Ethan's words. Even the logging representatives exchanged uneasy glances. The impact of Ethan's speech was immediate. Local news outlets picked up the story, and conservation groups reached out to support the cause. Jack helped Ethan write letters to state officials, and soon, the small town had rallied behind them. Signs reading "Save Our Forest" appeared in yards and shop windows, and petitions circulated with hundreds of signatures. Ethan's bravery inspired others to speak up. At another meeting, an elderly man shared memories of hiking in the forest as a boy, while a young mother talked about teaching her children to respect nature. The logging company faced mounting pressure to reconsider their plans. Weeks later, Ethan and Jack received the news they had been hoping for. The project had been halted, pending a review of its environmental impact. The forest and Shadow's home was safe, at least for now. Ethan stood at the edge of the woods that evening, Shadow by his side. "We did it," he said softly, resting a hand on her fur. "We saved your home." Shadow let out a soft huff, her golden eyes watching him with quiet understanding. Ethan smiled, feeling a deep sense of accomplishment. For the first time, he realized that his story wasn't just about survival. It was about protecting the things that mattered, no matter how big or small. The victory against the logging project had been a major milestone, but Ethan quickly learned that protecting the forest was an ongoing battle. As the weeks turned into months, new threats emerged, smaller, less publicized projects that chipped away at the edges of the wilderness he loved so deeply. Ethan refused to sit idly by. With Jack's support, he became a fierce advocate for the preservation of the forest and the wolves that called it home. One crisp morning, Jack and Ethan drove into town to meet with a group of conservationists. The small diner where they gathered was bustling with energy, the clinking of coffee mugs and the hum of conversation filling the air. A woman named Sarah, the leader of the group, greeted Ethan warmly. "You've made quite an impression, young man," Sarah said, her smile bright. "Your story has inspired a lot of people to care about this place. We could use your voice again." Ethan nodded, his determination unwavering. "I'll do whatever it takes to protect Shadow and the forest," he said. The group worked tirelessly to organize a new campaign, this time aimed at preventing a mining operation that threatened a nearby river. Ethan played a central role, appearing in local news interviews and even speaking at a regional conservation conference. His small stature and youthful sincerity made him an unforgettable presence, and his story of survival resonated deeply with audiences. At the conference, Ethan stood before a crowd of hundreds, a microphone in his hand and Jack watching proudly from the sidelines. "When I was lost, the forest didn't just keep me alive. It gave me a family," Ethan said, his voice clear and confident. "We don't have to choose between people and nature. We can protect both, but only if we work together." The room erupted into applause, and Ethan felt a spark of hope. He wasn't just a boy who had survived against the odds. He was becoming a voice for the voiceless. Back on the farm, Ethan balanced his advocacy work with his responsibilities at home and his visits to Shadow and the pack. Each trip to the forest felt like reconnecting with an old friend. Shadow greeted him with the same warmth and familiarity, and the pack's newest members, a pair of playful pups, brought a sense of renewal to their bond. One evening, as Ethan sat with Jack by the fireplace, he shared a thought that had been on his mind. "Do you think I could do this when I grow up?" he asked. "Fight for the forest, I mean." Jack smiled, his eyes filled with pride. "You're already doing it, kid, and you've got the heart and the smarts to keep going. The world needs people like you." Ethan nodded, his heart swelling with purpose. He didn't just want to protect the forest. He wanted to inspire others to see its value, to fight for it the way Shadow and the wolves had fought for him. The campaign against the mining project culminated in a large rally at the edge of the forest. Families, students, and activists gathered with signs, banners, and songs, their collective energy a testament to the growing movement. Ethan stood at the front, holding a handmade sign that read "Protect our forest, protect our future." When the mining company announced it would pause operations to conduct an environmental review, the crowd erupted into cheers. Ethan felt a surge of joy and relief. He knew the fight wasn't over, but each small victory brought them closer to a future where the forest and its inhabitants could thrive. That night, Ethan visited Shadow under the full moon. The gray wolf sat beside him, her golden eyes reflecting the light. "We did it again," Ethan whispered, scratching behind her ears. "And I'm not stopping. Not ever." Shadow leaned against him, her presence steady and strong. Ethan smiled, feeling the weight of the night settle around him like a warm blanket. He wasn't just defending the forest. He was defending the bond between humans and nature, a connection that had saved his life and shaped his future. Years passed, and Ethan grew from a boy into a young man. The farm, once a place of healing and safety, became a foundation for his life's work. Jack, now a bit slower with age, but as supportive as ever, continued to be Ethan's mentor and anchor. Together, they had built a small but thriving community of conservationists, farmers, and wildlife advocates who shared their vision for preserving the wilderness. Ethan's bond with Shadow and the wolves never faded. Though he visited them less often as his responsibilities grew, each reunion felt like coming home. Shadow had aged too, her once sleek fur now streaked with silver. Yet her eyes still held the same fierce intelligence and loyalty that had saved Ethan all those years ago. One late autumn evening, Ethan was leading a group of volunteers through a reforestation project near the edge of the woods. They planted young saplings, their laughter and camaraderie filling the crisp air. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the mountains, Ethan heard a rustling nearby. Stepping away from the group, he walked toward the sound and found himself face to face with a young boy, no older than 8, sitting alone near a fallen tree. The boy's clothes were torn, and his face was streaked with dirt. He clutched a small blanket, his eyes wide with fear. "Hey there," Ethan said gently, kneeling to the boy's level. "It's okay. You're safe now." The boy didn't respond, his gaze darting nervously toward the forest. Ethan followed his line of sight and froze. Emerging from the shadows was a wolf, a large, gray female with piercing golden eyes that reminded Ethan of Shadow. She moved cautiously, her body language protective yet calm. "It's okay," Ethan said softly, both to the boy and the wolf. "I know her family. They're good." The boy's lips trembled. "I got lost," he whispered, "and she found me." Ethan's heart swelled. The scene before him felt like a reflection of his own past, a cycle coming full circle. He reached out a hand, letting the wolf sniff him. She huffed softly before retreating into the shadows, as if trusting Ethan to take care of the boy. Ethan brought the boy back to the farm, where Jack helped clean him up and feed him. Through gentle coaxing, they learned his name was Lucas and that he had wandered away from a nearby campsite. His parents, frantic with worry, arrived later that evening, their gratitude overflowing. As the family drove away, Ethan stood on the porch with Jack, his thoughts swirling. "It's like it's happening all over again," he said quietly. "But this time, I could be the one to help." Jack clapped a hand on his shoulder. "That's the beauty of it, Ethan. You've taken what happened to you and turned it into something bigger, something that keeps giving back." The next day, Ethan returned to the forest. He carried no supplies, only his memories and gratitude. Shadow's descendant, whom he had named Echo, appeared with the pack, her golden eyes watching him closely. He knelt and extended his hand, a gesture of trust. "I'll keep doing my part," he whispered, his voice steady. "For you, for Shadow, and for everything this forest stands for." The wolves lingered for a while, their silent presence a reminder of the bond they shared. As Ethan walked back to the farm, he felt a deep sense of peace. He knew his work was far from over, but he also knew he wasn't alone. Shadow's legacy lived on, not just in her descendants, but in Ethan's heart and in the forest they had fought to protect together. He had become not just a defender of the wild, but a bridge between two worlds, proving that compassion and determination could create a lasting impact. Ethan's story became a beacon for others, inspiring a new generation to value the delicate balance between humans and nature. And as the seasons turned, the mountains stood as a testament to the power of connection, resilience, and hope. An enduring legacy that began with a boy, a wolf, and a bond that would never be broken. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and watch this next story. It's incredibly moving.